Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural James Hal Cone and Emilie M Towns Lecture, an event and lecture made possible by an anonymous and generous gift honoring two of Garrett's most distinguished and impactful alumni ever. And that is saying a lot for an institution with an over 170-year history. My name is Javier Viera. I welcome you into this space, and those of you joining us online. I have the privilege of being the president of this institution who gets to celebrate the lives and the ministries, the scholarship, the activism, the legacies of these inimitable alums who hallowed these halls with their brilliance and their fiery courage, whose work has challenged the church and called it to greater faithfulness, and whose scholarship chartered new theological, ethical, and historical terrain while creating spaces for a wider range of voices to be heard, people to be seen, and ideas to be considered. It's tempting in my role to want to claim their legacy and have it reflect so positively on Garrett and celebrate how great it is that Garrett had a part in training these two pioneering scholars. But I don't want to do that today. That seems a bit opportunistic, because what we should be doing is thanking them for choosing to come here, for thanking them for choosing to study here and to continue to be associated with us, because they honor us, even as we try with this lectureship to return their generosity. Now, you'll hear more about both of these giants of contemporary theology shortly. The Cone Towns Lecture was established not only to honor them both, but also to advance Black religious thought and the Black religious experience. Dr. Cone has, alas, moved on to greater glory, and so is not with us tonight physically. But I have no doubt that his spirit is here among us, and even in us. I can hear that sharp-pitched voice, so distinguished, that sharp-pitched voice humbly thanking us and probably still chastising us. He never hid his feelings, right, about his experiences here, but chastising us in the best sense of the word, in a sense, calling us to confront our inconsistencies and to live into our values and to become the people in the community we talk endlessly about becoming. Dr. Towns is thankfully with us and has allowed us to celebrate her and honor her tonight and now long into the future. Let's receive her. Can we just stand and let us... Now, her mellifluous and sonorous voice will soon fill this hall, but let me take a moment to personally welcome you, Emilie, and to thank you for so generously sharing your wisdom, your tireless labor, and your very person with this place and with this community and all of the subsequent communities that came since you were a student in these halls. Thank you for sharing yourself so fully with the church and with the academy, where you leave your most indelible mark. It's not only your body of scholarly work that has impacted the way that we think, the way that we practice faith, and the way that we function as institutions, but it is also your mentorship of so many scholars and leaders who are having tremendous influence across many different sectors. For that legacy, we too laud you, and we express our deepest gratitude and indebtedness. And my, oh my, has Garrett benefited from your mentorship of your students. I would be remiss also if I did not welcome your spouse, Dr. Laurel Schneider. herself a highly regarded and distinguished scholar of religious studies and Christian thought, gender theory, and Native American religious traditions, among others. Dr. Schneider is professor of religious studies at Vanderbilt University. And Laurel, we welcome you and thank you for sharing in this momentous event with us. Let's welcome Dr. Schneider as well. And while she'll be introduced more fully later, I would also be remiss if I didn't welcome our distinguished lecturer this evening, the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, herself a towering theologian and priest whose voice has been and continues to be so critical for the church and the academy, as well as in the public square. She's a former student of Dr. Cone and a collaborator and colleague and friend of Dr. Towns. When we shared with Dr. Towns the news of the creation of the Cone-Towns Lecture, we asked her to select and invite the inaugural speaker, and Kelly is the person that she chose. Dr. Brown Douglas, President Brown Douglas, we welcome you here tonight. We thank you in advance for the ways that we already know that you're going to challenge us and inspire us, discomfort us, and persuade us to think more deeply and act more deliberately and compassionately in our spheres, and we thank you for that. And lastly, let me also extend a warm word of welcome to President Angela Sims. Dr. Sims serves as president of Colgate-Rochester Crozer Divinity School and is also a renowned ethicist and scholar. And also Dr. JoAnne Marie Terrell, right here, associate professor of ethics and theology at Chicago Theological Seminary, just down the road from us. You enrich this experience, both of you, with your presence and your wisdom, and for that we thank you. So again, welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for sharing in this important evening. I now want to welcome my colleague and friend, the Reverend Dr. Reginald Blount, who is the Murray H. Leifer Associate Professor of Formation, Leadership, and Culture at Garrett and Director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience. Professor Blount.
Let me join with the President in thanking each and every one of you for coming out to this amazing, awesome inaugural event of the Cone-Town Lecture. I have the great privilege of making introductions to you for those who will be sharing with us this afternoon. And we're going to start with a salute to Dr. James Cone, which will be done by Dr. JoAnne Marie Terrell, who I count as sister and friend. Dr. JoAnne Marie Terrell is the Kenneth B. Smith Senior Professor of Public Ministry, Associate Professor of Theology, Ethics, and the Arts at Chicago Theological Seminary. She received her MDiv, Masters of Philosophy, PhD at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Be clear about which union it is, amen. Professor Terrell's current research interests are interreligious in scope and focus on soteriological principles in Taoism, Buddhism, and Christianity, the genre of spiritual autobiography, and the power of the visual and performing arts to affect personal, social, and cosmic transformation. These words are part of the introduction to her if you were to go to the site of Chicago Theological Seminary. These are her words. The world's unfolding narrative reveals too many burdensome predicaments that wreck personal, familial, social, and cosmic destruction, strain belief, challenge religious communities, and demand prophetic witness. As a Black womanist, spiritually eclectic theologian, my response has been to delve into the sustaining theological traditions, look to the arts, privilege creativity in the classroom, and utilize drama as public pedagogy. I have done so for as long as I have been a teacher because I understand that through art, the ineffable can be broached and pushes us towards new thoughts, new habits, new ways of being with and for each other. Despite the wretched conditions humankind continually faces, I believe in the beauty that is, and it is my scholarly and pastoral duty to pursue and find it. Won't you welcome Dr. JoAnne Marie Terrell.
I've got the blues, I've got the blues, I've got the deep purple womanist consciousness, self-love, and superwoman, broken-hearted black woman blues. Deep purple blues. Every day I gotta pray, 'cause I don't want to be tomorrow's bad news. Got the blues, got the blues. I've got the deep purple womanist consciousness, self-love, and superwoman, broken-hearted black woman blues. Deep purple blues. Every day I gotta pray, 'cause I don't want to be tomorrow's bad news. Day and night we gotta fight if we don't want to be tomorrow's bad news. Good afternoon. President Viera, Professor Director Reginald Blount, and faculty friends, staff, students, and all friends of Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary, thank you for the invitation to speak briefly about Dr. James Hal Cone, your late alumnus and my academic advisor, for whom I also served as research assistant for 5 years during my time at Union. Dr. Cone was one of the most influential systematic theologians of the 20th and 21st centuries, one of two of his emergence during the time of his emergence in the mid-1960s, the other being Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As womanist sociologist, minister, and preacher, Dr. Cheryl Townsend Jilks brought to our attention to the foreword of the 50th anniversary edition of his book, The Spirituals and the Blues. Today, I wish to speak on the subject, Legacy of a Blues Man, the Art and Soul of James H. Cone. It is a given that scholars stand on the shoulders of great thinkers from a variety of ages and contexts, people who gave shape not only to the discourses, but also to the world that all people everywhere are continuously making together. In this sense, the theological enterprise is no different from other academic endeavors, although it may be anachronistic to say it this way, since Western Christian theology was the matrix out of which Western scientific inquiry and methods emerged, to which science responded as the body of knowledge about the world and the people therein grew. Enlightenment science correspondingly rose to prominence in defining the world that we know, exerting its authority both to critique and to reify existing power structures already ratified by a hijacked, or as Dr. Cone described it, bankrupt Christianity, which called for the corrective lenses of Black theology, and in the late 1980s, womanist theology. As I was his mentee, he ensured that I would have the mentorship also of first-wave womanist Dolores Williams, for whom I served as tutor in the first womanist and feminist theology course taught at Union. Just as Black theology widened the discourse in the white liberal religious academy, So womanist theology widened the discourse of Black theology to help make it truly liberative for Black people and to empower our survival. As a theologian shaped by his experiences in the Black church and community and influenced mightily by the philosophy of existentialism, Dr. Cone demanded of me that I, with the I meaning my individual and collective self, become the subject of my own inquiry. The norm of liberation that entails has inspired a variety of liberation theologies in the North American context. This intellectual legacy is largely due to my guru's immense physical and spiritual energy. His aura was effulgent, like that of the sun, and he walked and talked like someone who knows that he or she is, or they are, persons of consequence. This is why in his 50 years of teaching at Union, he was able to produce 50 PhDs who are themselves on the cutting edge of insights that enhance the enterprise and are helping remake the world. It is awe-inspiring to walk literally in the footsteps of a giant at Garrett and Northwestern, the places where Dr. Cone honed his penchant for disciplined, accessible writing. As his longest-serving research assistant and protege, I observed firsthand his habit of reading for 8 hours every day of his life. He told me that when he went home to visit his beloved mother, he would only do it on the condition that she not disturb his reading time. One summer, the summer of 1994, I spent those 8 hours with him in his home every day because the facilities crew were going to repaint his library, which consisted of 2 medium-sized rooms in his Knox Hall apartment. And he entrusted me with the task of removing the books, boxing them up, and placing them back on the shelves once the paint had dried. I felt like the Karate Kid, and he was Mr. Miyagi. I thought he was giving me a pointless exercise. Wax on, wax off. I lifted heavy boxes while he read for 8 full hours every day for a whole summer. But by the time the summer was over, I had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of what was available in Black theology and Black literature. In addition, the exercise of reading book titles and correlating their themes with particular authors had stimulated my own thinking in ways that I could not have anticipated. I was a doctoral student then, but from my very first semester in the MDiv program at Union, Dr. Cone invested a lot of faith in me, both as a student and as someone whom he could befriend. At some point in time, he asked me to help him update his music collection, which was comprised mostly of blues music from the likes of Bobby Blue Bland, Jimmy Reed, Bessie Smith. He loved Dinah Washington, and Muddy Waters. He was indeed a blues man, but his collection also contained the spiritual music of Mahalia Jackson, the queen of the civil rights movement, and the spiritual and secular music of Aretha Franklin, the queen of soul. I introduced him to people like Mary J. Blige, Jodeci, Toni Braxton, Public Enemy, and Randy Crawford. But this was in the 1990s. And I now require the same kind of help from my young adult daughter. Dr. Cone impressed me so much with his love for the visual and the performed arts and the range of creative self-expression in the Black community in particular, which he saw as important forms of resistance, but were frowned upon in rarefied academic discourse. At the entrance to his home, he had placed a framed portrait of Judith Jameson of Alvin Ailey fame dancing, her solo dance called Cry. The visual art goes by the same name. Jameson said that the dance depicts the people, quote, who came from the hardships of slavery, through the pain of losing loved ones, through overcoming extraordinary depressions and tribulations. I began to notice the Black poets whose works preface most of Dr. Cone's writings, and the musicians whose lyrics serve as prologues to chapters. Like Fats Waller's poignant lyrics that are prologue to chapter 6 in the Spirituals and the Blues. What did I do to be so black and blue? Dr. Cone argued that Black people invented the blues to be secular spirituals, while ignoring the religious concerns of the church. The blues helped postbellum Black people express frustration with the contradictions of Black existence, as attempts to resolve existential tensions of life lived in relationship to partners, families, communities, societies, economies. Stemming from the same existential realities that spawned the spirituals, Dr. Cone said, the blues are about Black life and the sheer earth and gut capacity to survive in an extreme situation of oppression. Though in music, the blues scale carries a minor tonality, the blues themselves are a paradox of ingenuity that enables Black people to express not only frustration, but also shouted, sometimes raucous confidence in their consequentialness, the fact of their somebodyness, the fact that their thoughts, their feelings, their minds, their hearts, their lives matter. And I think this is why Dr. Cone recognized me as his student, as one who was then being propelled through life, and probably still, in a minor tonality, as a blues person with a song inside that wanted for expression, that wanted and wants somebodyness. Somebodyness is to have personhood. To be a person, Dr. Cone said, is to be in control of one's destiny, to set concrete limitations on the movement of self and of others' selves in relationship to self. It is to be free. It is to work or not to work, to laugh and cry, to make love, to eat and sleep at the close of the day. All this implies a measure of power to make others recognize one's humanity. And this is the substance of his legacy to me and to so many others.
Thanks so much, Dr. Terrell. James Cone, the blues man, amen. Some of you have read his work. You know of his complex relationship with Garrett. But I would be remiss if I did not say that one of our former directors of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience was able to bring Dr. Cone back to Garrett, Dr. Linda Thomas. And that's when the healing began. So Dr. Cone and Garrett healed together. And I am so glad that that happened. We will now have Dr. Angela Sims to come and to share the celebration of Dr. Emilie Towns and her scholarship and work. Allow me to offer introduction to Dr. Sims. The Reverend Dr. Angela D. Sims is the 13th and first woman president of Colgate-Rochester Crozier Divinity School, where she also serves as the John Price Crozier Professor of Social Ethics. Dr. Sims' research examines connections between faith, race, and violence, with specific attention to historical and contemporary Ethical Implications of Lynching and a Culture of Lynching in the United States. She is the principal investigator for an oral history project called Remembering Lynching: Strategies of Resistance and Visions of Justice. She is the author of numerous books and articles, the most recent of which is entitled Lynched: The Power of Memory in a Culture of Terror. Won't you welcome Dr. Angela Sims.
President Viera, Dean Harvey, Director Blount, thank you for your kind invitation, and I am appreciative of the hospitality that I have received since I arrived in Evanston today. In her own words, Emilie M. Towns, Dean Emerita and the Distinguished Professor of Womanist Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, offered an insight in her first monograph, published in 1993, that 31 years later illustrates an imperative to value the lives and experiences of Black women as sources for moral discernment. Towns wrote, and I quote, "One day, I realized that the pictures on the wall of my grade school were mostly men. The only exceptions were Ida B. Wells Barnett, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth. Occasionally, Mary McLeod Bethune was added, but the pantheon of women's lives was limited in comparison to the men. Like many young Black girls, I assumed that men were the doers of the great things and that only exceptional women ever became leaders of our race," close quote. For those of you who might need a subject reference, Emilie M. Towns, an exceptional person and leader. A premier scholar at the intersection of Christian ethics, theological ethics, womanist ethics, and social systems, the Reverend Dr. Emilie M. Towns is an exceptional person and leader, recognized by the Society of Christian Ethics and the American Academy of Religion as a leading scholar of religion. Towns is a professionally accomplished scholar. Drawing on almost 4 decades of experience in theological education, she is attentive to dynamics of race, gender, class, orientation, identity, and other social constructions that influence how one both reads text and listens to and responds to socio-cultural issues that inform notions of justice. For as Towns writes in her essay, Ethics as an Art of Doing the Work Our Souls Must Have, the challenges for a womanist ethicist is to create and then articulate a positive moral standard that critiques the elitism of dominant ethics at its oppressive core and is relevant for the African American community and the larger society, close quote. As a Christian womanist ethicist, Towns takes seriously the lives and contributions of Black women as central points of reference and sources for theological and social ethics. This is evident in her body of work. For Towns was the first to write about anti-lynching advocate and investigative journalist Ida B. Wells from a religious perspective. Towns' 1989 dissertation, The Social and Moral Perspectives of Ida B. Wells Barnett as Resources for a Contemporary Afro-Feminist Christian Social Ethic, and published in 1993 as Womanist Justice, Womanist Hope, explores the social and moral spheres of Black women in the 19th century through Wells's life and work, with specific emphasis on Wells' strong commitment to social justice and to the church as an active churchwoman. Towns argues that Wells' understanding of liberation, reconciliation, suffering, and obedience function as a framework for outlining a contemporary womanist Christian social ethic. Similarly, Towns is among the first womanist religious scholars to advance a concept of womanist spirituality as social witness, informed by an analysis of Black women's moral wisdom as documented in a variety of literary genres. While Wells' way of thinking about leadership is the principal criterion for Towns' proposed Christian social ethic, in her second monograph, In a Blaze of Glory, Womanist Spirituality as Social Witness, Towns demonstrates why the Womanist Project must take a fuller measure of the nature of injustice and inequalities of human existence from the perspective of Black women. Of urgency for Towns is the need for Black people to assume the challenge and responsibility to become change agents in their respective communities. As such, Towns invites readers to consider what is required to facilitate a healing transformation that may be informed by, but not restricted to, ecclesial practices and teachings of the church. In a manner like that articulated by Toni Morrison in her novel Beloved, Towns considers the significance for Black society and culture when love of self is grounded in an understanding of wholeness that is antithetical to constructed forms of dualism and fragmentations, but consonant with African cosmology that understands all of life as sacred. With her assertion that womanist spirituality adds its voice to any spirituality that is based on hope, almost 30 years since publication, Towns in a Blaze of Glory remains relevant given its insistence that the one thing that is sure in womanist spirituality is that we must know the Spirit. With a keen awareness of the role of science and its relationship to the quality of an individual's and a community's well-being, Towns is breaking the fine reign of death, African American health issues, and a womanist ethic of care, interrogates competing moralities and associated implications about a country's national health. Writing during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, Towns highlights several moral issues that disproportionately affect people of color. A quarter of a century since publication, Breaking the Fine Reign of Death remains a valuable resource from which to gain insights about and suggestions to address health as a cultural production. As such, Town invites us to consider that, and I'm going to quote, and I won't do it in the poetic voice that Emilie has, but she writes, "Hope is a spirit that is within and without us. It calls us to itself, to ourselves, to one another. It is a spirit that moves and shapes, figures and reconfigures. It is swift, it is slow. It is timeless, it is time-filled. It is a spirit that leads us beyond what we can touch or see or feel. This hope is not discursive and discrete. It is not rimmed with ontological categories that search to keep us from our health. This hope is lament, is community, is love, is justice, is healing. It is the very heart and soul of who we are, and how we can be, and how far we have yet to go. It is the spirit of promise. It is the spirit of refusing to accept the realities in which we all dwell, in which we try to survive and do survive, in which we try to live, and sometimes, through amazing feats of moving through, we not only live, but thrive, actually shimmer with life and hope and justice and righteousness. Oh, so holy and righteous anger. This hope reminds us that we cannot accept the death-dealing and life-denying ways in which we have often structured our existences or had our worlds ordered for us through the Tuskegees, the HIV/AIDS, through the inadequate clinical trials, through unaffordable health care, through unattainable insurance. We must act through a faith that is grounded in what the wise old folks tell us about living and hoping and refusing and cussing and praying and doing the work of justice to bring ourselves home again. Thank you, Emilie, for those words. This brings me to Towns' womanist ethics and the cultural production of evil. It is a tour de force, employing an intersectional analytical approach that has come to characterize her research and writing. Towns provides a deep assessment of systems by which evil is sustained and perpetuated. Her work on memory and our human capacity to confront ways in which individual and collective imagination shapes perceptions of self and others can function and ought to function as a resource to further honest engagement about race that remains a moral dilemma in our collective life. A master griot, Towns' ability to present complex, nuanced theological concepts in language that can be received and comprehended by diverse audiences offers insights into syncretic movements related to her interdisciplinary areas of expertise. In this regard, Towns is recognized as a trailblazer whose teaching and research continues to influence the academic study of religion, while at the same time remaining accessible to non-academicians. An active member of several academic guilds, Towns is the first Black woman elected to the presidential line of the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Christian Ethics. She is also the first Black person to serve as Dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School, the first Black person and woman to serve as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Yale Divinity School, and the first Black person to receive tenure and advancement to full professor at St. Paul's School of Theology. Writing and lecturing extensively on gender, race, and religion in the United States, she is the author or editor of 10 books and numerous book chapters and peer-reviewed articles. Invited to deliver lectures and scholarly presentations at major universities in the United States and abroad, her 2009 election as an American Academy of Arts and Sciences Fellow is reflective of her commitment to collaboration and interdisciplinarity that is evident in every aspect of her research, scholarship, and creative expression. This honor, along with her 2021 induction as a Martin Luther King Jr. Board of Preachers, Sponsors, and Collegium of Scholars, is suggestive of the way Towns, through her teaching and research, is representative of a school of thought that values the cultivation of the mind through intentional interaction with others as a means by which to bring forth ideas that change the world. The Reverend Dr. Emilie M, Towns, an exceptional person and leader, in her own words, invites scholars of religion to consider that, and I quote, "Our job is to allow the richness of insights and experiences beyond what we know and don't know to fill our scholarship with deeper meaning, to beget more piercing insights that form our students and colleagues because we live into the lively banter of scholarship that frees and emboldens, as it offers more questions than answers, as we seek to be more relevant and strategic in the work that we do. So we create spaces that form a community of scholars and teachers and learners and administrators and clergy and lay folk and more who are moving into a more vibrant, more life-bringing and giving, more welcoming, more humane, more alive with possibilities that cherish and use the deep knowledge we have that the holy is not done with any of us yet, so that we must live our lives with justice and hope." And as the old Black women who raised Emilie and some of us gathered today used to say about such things, Again, thank you, Emilie. Emilie, thank you for your gifts in service to the Academy, in service to the church, in service to the world. You are one remarkably exceptional person and leader.
Thank you, Dr. Sims. So when I had a conversation with Dr. Towns, Emilie, about what she would envision for this lectureship and this time together, she said, great conversation, great music, and great food. I hope the dinner last night was good. And I envision tonight will be just as equally as well. But now it's for further conversation and music. Amen? I'm a former pastor, y'all, so y'all may get amen a lot. Let me first introduce our psalmist for today, and then I will introduce our inaugural lecturer. LaQuentin Jenkins, known as Q. He is an accomplished singer, songwriter, and educator, born and raised in the small town of Dalzell, South Carolina. Raised in a musical family with deep roots in the Pentecostal holiness tradition, music became an undeniable, life-giving reality. Quentin's musical interest peaked once he joined his high school chorus. It was there that he learned the language of music and had space to cultivate his sound and overall musical approach. And after high school, he began his undergraduate studies at Claflin University on a music scholarship, where he sang and traveled with the award-winning Claflin University Concert Choir and directed the award-winning Claflin University Gospel Choir. His introduction to music and theology at Claflin sparked his academic imagination that grew over the years with his vast educational experiences. And after graduating from Claflin, Q moved to Evanston to begin his graduate studies at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. in the Masters of Divinity program with a music ministry focus. He also obtained a certificate in Black Sacred Music Studies from McCormick Theological Seminary under the tutelage of Dr. Alicia Lola Jones. He currently serves as a new worship leader at Valley Kingdom Ministries International in Oak Forest, Illinois, the home of the award-winning gospel music aggregation Shekinah Glory Ministries, under the leadership of Pastor Ray Beatty. And when he is not in church, he enjoys performing and traveling with the Emmy Award-winning Adrian Dunn and the Adrian Dunn Singers, the D.L. Perkins Singers, Carsey Barnes, and Favorite Friday ABC, and the Beats Mix Music Corporation in Chicago. And I now have the honor of introducing our inaugural lecture, the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who serves as the interim president of the Episcopal Divinity School. From 2017 to 2023, she was dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and professor of theology. She was named the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology at Union in November 2019. She also serves as the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and theologian in residence at Trinity Church, Wall Street. Prior to Union, Douglas served as professor of religion at Goucher College, where she held the Susan D. Morgan Professorship of Religion and is now Professor Emeritus. Before Goucher, she was Associate Professor of Theology at Howard University of Divinity and Assistant Professor of Religion at Edward Waters. Ordained as an Episcopal priest in 1983, Dr. Douglas holds a master's degree in theology and a PhD in systematic theology from Union. She is the author of many articles and 6 books, including Sexuality in the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective, Standing Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, and Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter, which won the 2023 Gallmeyer Award in Religion. Her academic work has focused on womanist theology, sexuality, and the Black church. And speaking of the Black church, you would often hear them before the preacher or speaker would come. After our musical selection, the next voice that you will hear is that from Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas.
Good evening, everyone. Would you do me a favor as you feel led and comfortable and look at someone next to you and say, hello? It's great to know who you're worshiping with. I want to honor the president of this wonderful institution. Thank you so much to a man who quite simply changed my life during my time here at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. Without his words of wisdom, his heart. Check 1, 2. Is this a little better? Amazing. Without his kind words, without his heart for people, without his mentorship, I would not be where I am today. Dr. Reggie Blount, I love you. Thank you so much for this space. To all of my former professors, classmates, and cohorts, hey, I love you. I want to honor a request from Dr. Blount and then sing as I feel led and sit down and get on out the way. In the words of my uncle in Dazzle, South Carolina, I don't want to make you glad twice. Glad to see me get up and glad to see me sit down. There's a song that's been adapted from the spiritual tradition called Give Me Jesus that has been since redone, reimagined by a friend of mine, Adrian Dunn, and I'd like to sing a little piece of that for you tonight. Jesus, oh Jesus, there is something about your name. Some call you Master, Savior, oh Jesus. Just like the fragrance after the rain. Oh, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Let all heaven and earth proclaim that kings and their kingdoms, one day they shall all pass away. Aren't you glad about it? But there's something about that name, Jesus. Jesus. Oh, Jesus. There's still something about his name. I call him Master, Savior, Jesus. You're like the fragrance after the rain. Jesus, Jesus, oh Jesus, let all heaven and earth, may we all proclaim that kings and the kingdoms, one day they shall all pass away. But there's something, but there's something, but there is something about that name.
My goodness, I'm Episcopalian, and that's not the kind of music we're used to following. Thank you so much for your ministry of song. Thank you all for being here with us this evening to honor giants in theology, in ethics, giants in just doing what's right. It is such a pleasure and a privilege to be the James Cone Emilie Towns Inaugural Lecture on this evening. Dr. Cone was my mentor, was my friend, without whom I would not be doing theology. Emilie is my sister, my friend, who every day pushes me to be not simply a better thinker, but a better person, without whom I wouldn't have the moral imaginary to imagine what justice should look like. Thank you, my sister friend. Thank you, Dr. Viera and Dr. Blount, for the very gracious invitation of being here. And for all of you who are also online, thank you for your presence, and I want to thank especially, and I believe at least 2 of his children are joining us online, Dr. Cohn's children, Crystal, Robin, Michael, and Charles. Thank you for sharing your father with the world and with each of us. This evening, I want to, I hope, honor the legacy of Dr. Cohn and the scholarship and work of Dr. Emilie Towns in this lecture on this evening. From the manger to the cross, restless for God's justice. I was reminded by my mentor and leading Caribbean theologian and Anglican priest, Courtwright Davis, that theology is a way of life. It has certainly been that way for me. Long before I knew the word theology or that there were even folk called theologians, I was trying to figure out the meaning of my faith in and for my life. I wondered what my faith in the God of Jesus Christ had to do with my blackness. It is in this way that Anselm is right. Theology is faith seeking understanding. We cannot be reminded enough that theology is not an abstract enterprise that randomly speculates on the being of God and the Godhead. Whether a theologian admits it or not, theology is always contextual, if not subjective, reflection on the meaning of God. It emerges as we wrestle with the questions and contradictions that our life realities put to our faith. In fact, it is when we don't acknowledge the inherent contextual nature of theology and instead treat theology as if it is objective thought about God that theology goes all wrong. For we can then more easily project ourselves onto God, creating a God in our own image and then declaring our theology normative and universal. Emilie Towns puts it this way in her Ethics. She says, and I quote her, "Genuine intellectual engagement begins with the concreteness of our humanity rather than an esoteric concept abstracted from life that teach us or lure us into believing that it is better to live in an unrelenting," she says, "ontological suicide watch rather than a celebration of the richness and responsibilities of what it means to be created in the image of God." In the end, any theology grounded in the pretensions of abstract universal thinking betrays the very God of Jesus Christ, who meets us not somewhere up there, but down here in the messy particularities of human living. As James Cone so aptly put it, God meets us in the human situation, not as an ideal or concept that is self-evidently true. God encounters us in the human condition. Although God is indeed, he says, the intended subject of theology, God does not do theology. Human beings do theology. The theology I humbly do, from my books to articles to lectures, always reflects the questions generated not from the quiet and speculative recesses of my mind, but rather from the complicated and sometimes confusing spaces of my living. This brings me to this lecture this evening. On March 25th, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr., along with thousands of others, completed a 5-day, 54 miles march from Selma, Alabama to Alabama's capital, Montgomery, once the capital of the Confederacy. This march, a protest to secure Black voting rights, was the culmination of a march attempted 2 weeks earlier that was turned back as marchers were savagely beaten trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge on their way out of Selma. That day, as many of you know, would come to be known as Bloody Sunday. But 2 weeks later, as King addressed a crowd of 25,000 people, he asked the question of the psalmist, "How long, O Lord, how long?" This question was for King on that day, as it was for the psalmist before him, a question of faith born from a restlessness for God's justice to be made known. As Black people continue to face the dehumanizing policies and deadly violence of white racism, King no doubt gave voice to that which many of the Black faithful were asking. How long, O Lord, how long? How long, he asked, will justice be crucified? 59 years after King asked this question, a palpable restlessness for God's justice continues. It is the restlessness I heard expressed by the family of Jayland Walker after the acquittal of 8 police officers who fired over 90 shots at him during a June 2022 traffic stop in Akron, Ohio. Jayland was stopped because he was Black. He was murdered because he was Black, and there is no indictment today because he is Black, a family member said. A restlessness for God's justice. I also heard this restlessness in the words of a pregnant Black mother in October after she and her 8-year-old son Brandon were pulled over by police with guns drawn and police helicopters hovering overhead because the police allegedly mistook her 8-year-old son, who she was driving to football practice, for a juvenile with 2 felony warrants. I'm scared for him and how he is going to be treated in the future. It's too young for him to be scared that way, his mother said, a restlessness for God's justice. The restlessness for God's justice has become even more pronounced at this time as we watch dehumanizing, deadly, and genocidal violence played out in the Middle East and even here in the suburbs of Chicago. I heard the restlessness for justice in the words of 6-year-old Wadi Alim Fayoumes, and forgive me if I've mispronounced his name. His father, who said after the stabbing of his son, he didn't die because he's Palestinian or Jordanian. He didn't die because he's Muslim. I came to this country because I felt like it's safe, Wadi's father said. And here's what happened to my son. No one deserves to treat anyone like that. A restlessness for God's justice. This very restlessness can be heard in the words of 22-year-old music-loving Alan Hoyle's mother, who was giving a concert in his honor after he was taken hostage by Hamas. She said, "Music says that we have to stop and we have to do something. The government and the world, I hope, will help the young." A restlessness for God's justice. And then there were the words through tears of a mother, Tahani Nasser, a refugee at the Rafah tent camp. "I've been begging to feed my children and don't find anything. My children just told me today that they were craving chicken. Where would I find them chicken? Where do I know? May Allah save us." A restlessness for God's justice. And then there are the words of 51-year-old woman, Reverend, as the Rafah tent camp came under attack this week. "We are tired and cannot bear any more of this torture. I don't know where to go. There is no safe place." A restlessness for God's justice. And so I have found myself asking with an urgent restlessness, how long, O Lord, how long? How long will it take for Black lives to not just matter in this world, but to be respected and regarded as the sacred lives that they are? How long will it take for all of our children to feel safe and to have a place to lay their head? How long will it take for the sacred humanity of brown and Black bodies across the globe to be respected, for brown and Black lives to be valued? And so on this evening, I invite you into a journey of faith with me as I contemplate the meaning of God's justice in light of especially Black crucifying realities with implication for others who perhaps feel a restlessness for God's justice. Now, interestingly enough, as I was thinking about where to start this lecture, I realized that my restlessness for God's justice was actually what brought me to theology. I have written about this before, but it's worth briefly revisiting here tonight. When I was about 7 years old, I remember riding with my parents through the inner city of my hometown, Dayton, Ohio. It was a rainy evening. I looked out the window of the car and I noticed a little Black girl and boy crossing the street. They looked about my age. I presumed them to be sister and brother. They were a bit disheveled and not properly dressed for the cold, rainy weather. From my 7-year-old perspective, they looked poor and hungry. Tears literally filled my eyes as I imagined for them a life of struggle. In the midst of my tears, I made a silent vow to one day come back and rescue those two children from the blight of Dayton's inner city. From that moment on, I was determined to find a vocation that could make a difference in the lives of those children, particularly those who were trapped in life-negating conditions. As I got older, the thought of those children never left me. Not only did they create within me a deep sense of accountability to the poor and marginalized in our society, especially those who look like me, but seeing those children also became the foundation for other questions that would later challenge my faith about God's love, about God's justice. But there was something else that would also drive those questions besides those children, and that was Jesus. I grew up in the only Black Episcopal church in Dayton, St. Margaret's. Nearly every Sunday, I would awaken my parents and ask them to take me to church, even if they weren't planning to go that day. One of the reasons I liked going to church, especially as a young child, was that I loved hearing stories about Jesus. One of the most compelling yet saddest stories I heard was about his birth. I remember that I simply could not understand how people allowed a baby to be born in a cold barn and laid in a manger. I literally cried every time we sang the song, "Away in a Manger, No Crib for Bed." These words reminded me of the girl and boy I had seen that rainy evening. Somehow, I instinctively knew that there was a connection between Jesus' manger birth and those children's inner city life. As time went on, I would try to figure out this connection, but not before a period of profound doubt. My experiences of growing up in Dayton, a city with a history of segregation and racial unrest, along with my experiences of being called the N-word, schooled me in the violence of anti-Black white racism. Moreover, these experiences made me not only very wary of white people, but also of my faith in Jesus. Indeed, as an assertive pride in my Blackness grew alongside an intense and intimate understanding of what philosopher and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois meant when he said that the problem of 20th century America is the problem of the color line, my questions of faith increased. I wanted to know how God, the God of the one born in a manger, could let Black people be treated so badly. By my junior year of college, my childhood love for Jesus was slowly being replaced by a deep skepticism. I wanted to know if the Jesus I loved unconditionally as a child loved me back unconditionally. Inasmuch as my faith was seeking understanding, I was questioning if God was truly just. While I did not know how to articulate it at the time, I was restless for the justice of God. It was then that my college chaplain, recognizing my restless angst, introduced me to James Cone's book, A Black Theology of Liberation. This book answered my questions in ways that I could have never imagined. In this book, Cone declared in no uncertain terms, he said that Jesus is the Black Christ. And most significantly for me at that time in my life, he made clear that because Jesus, and I quote him, was born in a stable and cradled in a manger, the equivalent of a beer case in a ghetto alley, he said, that meant that Jesus, in my mind, was one with all those black children who were trapped in life-draining inner-city realities. Furthermore, Cone pronounced that the definition of Christ as black means that Christ represents the complete opposite, Cone said, of the values of white culture and leads the warfare against the white assault on blackness. Wow. What more needed to be said? My faith in the God of Jesus Christ was vindicated. These answers served me for a long time theologically. Even as I began to develop a womanist perspective, one that would be informed by my dialogue with womanists like Emily Towns, I continued to hold on to the Black God and Jesus of Cone's theology. That is, until my youthful images of black children crossing the street were steadily overtaken by images of black children dying in the street. These were children whose names were Trayvon, Jordan, Renisha, Tamir, Sandra, Michael, and so many, many, many more. These were young black human lives being snuffed out from the sin of anti-black racism for no other apparent reason than the fact that they were black lives. These were lives trapped in what Towns has insightfully described in her work as a panopticon-like gaze, in which she says illiteracy about black lives quickly morphs into stereotypes that damn and eviscerate black children, men and women. And so, while Jesus' manger birth continued to have resonance for me, it was Jesus' crucifying death that came to the forefront of my theological questioning. I began to really wonder about the propriety of black people maintaining a faith with a cross at its center, given the incessant crucifying realities of black living. And so it was at about that time I began to explore more deeply the black faith tradition. I deeply appreciated that this was a faith that was forged in the midst of one of the most perverse and inhumane realities of life, slavery. I knew that this was a faith in a Jesus who, because he was crucified, let black people know that he understood their pain and suffering, their hopes and dreams. And so it was in this way that I understood that Jesus' crucifixion signaled his identification with young black people dying in the streets. It was, in fact, in their faces that I could see the crucified Jesus. It would be his appreciation, indeed, for the convergence of the black experience in Jesus' crucifixion that led James Cone to write his final theological treatise, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. He explained, the more I reflected on the cross and the lynching tree, the more I understood why black Christians could not turn away from the cross, even though that symbol was used to enslave, segregate, and lynch them. The cross, he said, did not make black suffering easier to bear, but it enabled some people to survive it. That is the great paradox of black life, he said. We can't solve this dilemma. It's a great wound we have to live with. The cross is a part of the Christian tradition so long as the world remains unredeemed. It is the answer, he said, to oppressed people who struggle for liberation. It remains at the center of black life in the United States in the form of the lynching tree. However, even in my knowing the power of the cross and black faith as Cone described it, I still began to question such a cross-centered faith and theology would it allow us to imagine a world free of anti-black-white racist oppression that it was not predicated on black sacrificial death. I wondered if seeing the crucified Jesus in the faces of murdered black human beings was nothing less than a present-day version of a classical atonement tradition that has emphasized redemptive sacrifice. More particularly, I wondered if this implied that black death was necessary in order to redeem society and the world from the sin of anti-black white racism and indeed white supremacy. After all, it was not lost on me that it was in response to George Floyd's murder that Black Lives Matter protests erupted across the globe, inaugurating for some, even if fleeting, a time of reckoning to purge the world of this sin. As religion scholar Biko Mandela Gray pointed out, there's something about the way, he said, in which the world lynches and kills black people for its own salvation that feels Christological in the worst way. My wrestling with this Christological reality led me to my book, Resurrection Hope. Now, even though I emphasized in this book that the cross is not the end of the story, and thus salvation is not to be found in the blood of Jesus, and hence in the sacrifice of black lives, but rather in the resurrection of Jesus, I have since wondered if I moved toward the resurrection in hope way too soon. Had it become for me a way to avoid sitting in not simply the paradoxes of the cross and black life as Cone described, but in the uncomfortable contradictions of the cross, in the unsettling elusiveness of God's justice. Further fueling my concerns about the justice of God, even in the wake of writing Resurrection Hope, was the starkly disquieting reality that black experience is one in which the humanity, as Towns has put it, of black people has consistently been contested. Indeed, my despair, if not rage, only intensified as it became increasingly clear that even our children's very humanness is discounted. And so it is that I have found myself raging over and over again with the question of how can people treat our children like that? Why can people not see that our children are not dangerous beasts? Watching the children of Gaza looking in toilets for water to drink, looking for even a blade of grass to eat, or crying out for help from under the bodies of their dead parents, I have wondered why people cannot see that our brown and black children are actually human beings with bodies that need care, hearts that need love, and with dreams that need to be fulfilled. This lack of empathy for our very children, a lack which my friend and psychologist Rhonda Hobson calls empathetic incapacitation, has been virtually incomprehensible for me. Even in knowing the violent dynamics of white supremacist racism, I have still found it hard to comprehend how human beings could treat other human beings, especially children, with such utter disregard. What does the cross have to say about this? And what does it mean about the justice of God? And so it is that I have turned back to the cross to wrestle with what it tells us about the justice of God, and hence about the propriety of a cross-centered faith for a crucified people whose very humanity is contested. As I turned back to the cross, what I came to realize was that I needed to change the way in which I have looked at the cross if my theological and moral imaginary was to be expanded regarding the meaning of God's justice. After years of reciting the Nicene Creed, Sunday after Sunday in church, I realized that I have unwittingly absorbed into my theological consciousness a notion of the cross that actually distorts the meaning of the crucifixion itself, and in so doing obscures the meaning of God's justice. The creed goes like this, you know it. We believe in one God, Father, ruler of all, maker of heaven and earth, in Jesus Christ, who for us human beings and for our salvation came down from heaven, was incarnate from the Holy Spirit and Mary the Virgin, and became human, and was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate. Something's missing. What is striking, as I've pointed out in earlier work, is that the creed moves directly from Jesus' birth to his crucifixion and then to his resurrection. Most notably missing from the creed is any reference to Jesus' ministry. His ministry is all but dismissed and thereby rendered inconsequential to not only what it meant for him to be crucified, but also what it meant for him to be Christ. The creed implies in its movement from the manger to the cross that Jesus was born to die. The Nicene Creed effectively suggests that what matters most when understanding the significance of Jesus for Christian faith is not how he lived, but rather the fact that he suffered a hideous death on the cross. Historically, such an emphasis has given way to Western doctrines of atonement that have not only fostered pietistic notions of sin and personal salvation, but have also laid the foundation for troubling notions of redemptive suffering. That is, notions, as I mentioned earlier, that find power in the blood of Jesus and salvific meaning in the suffering, if not sacrifice, of other human beings. Ironically, as central as the creed has been to the Western theological tradition, so much so that it continues to be recited in many churches like my own as a summary of our faith, it actually distorts our faith, as it belies the gospel's portrayals of Jesus. For even in their differences, the Gospels all focus on Jesus' ministry. As such, his ministry becomes the frame through which to understand what it meant for him to be Christ, and concomitantly, it is the key for discerning the significance of his crucifixion, and as such, for discerning the meaning of God's justice in light of crucifying realities. And so, what does the Gospel tell us about this? In short, they tell us that Jesus' ministry was focused on driving history forward, that is, toward a future where the justice of God is made evident. His ministry was therefore a disruptive force as it disturbed the cultural, social, political, and ecclesiastical norms of his day. It did so in at least two noteworthy ways. First, by making those who were socially marginalized and demonized in society the central focus of his ministry. In so doing, he disrupted any social, religious, or cultural beliefs or mores that suggested that those folks were anything less than children of God, deserving to be treated as such. Second, with his future-directed ministry, Jesus asserted God's authority and rule over any earthly human authority. It was to God and God's future that Jesus was accountable, and moreover, that he called those who would follow him to be likewise accountable. So not surprisingly, Jesus' ministry created much enmity between himself and the ruling powers of the day. His non-cooperation with accepted customs and his insolence in respect to ruling authorities was unacceptable to the governing leaders. Thus, in the end, the political and religious authorities of his first-century Roman world collaborated to rid themselves of the Jesus problem. They came together to crucify him. It is with a renewed appreciation for these general grounds for Jesus' crucifixion, even if we don't know the specific catalytic event for it, that the meaning of the cross comes into focus. For contrary to the emphasis of the Nicene Creed, the cross signifies not to Jesus' death, but to his life. Put another way, it points us not to the importance of the way he died, but to the importance of the way he lived. In so doing, it shifts the salvific emphasis from being about pietistic, individualistic salvation secured by a sacrificed Savior to being about human and social transformation found in the ministry of Jesus. Furthermore, to understand the crucifixion in the complexity of its historical context as provided by the Gospels precludes any notion that God was party to or sanctioned in any way Jesus' crucifixion. Simply put, people who wielded subjugating and oppressive power, not God, crucified Jesus. Any divine meaning to be found in the act of crucifixion itself relates to God's compassionate and uncompromised solidarity with the subjugated and oppressed, to the crucified classes of people, not to God's acceptance of their oppression and the crucifying realities of their living. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Put simply, God is not responsible for or complicit in the crucifixion itself. Accordingly, it cannot be said enough that when understood within its historical context, the cross defies any attempts to provide divine sanction, that is, theological legitimation, for unwarranted human suffering and death, as if it is redemptive. With that said, there's still a crucifixion at the center of Christian faith. There's no avoiding the cross. For it was Jesus' ministry that inexorably led to his crucifixion. And this brings us back to the question of God's justice. How are we to understand the justice of God in light of the crucifixion, and hence the crucifying realities that continue to destroy Black lives? What does the cross tell us? It tells us that which Black faith affirmed and has been said by theologians of liberation and others before, that inasmuch as the cross indicates Jesus' solidarity with the outcast and oppressed of his day, God's justice is made known to the oppressed in their struggles for justice. It is the ones who've experienced the raw realities of injustice, who know the extent of transformation needed to realize God's justice. They are less likely to confuse privilege with justice. The point is, only when those who have been on the underside of justice, those who've experienced crucifying realities, began to experience justice, it is only then that we can begin to see at least a glimpse of God's justice. And so it is the cross makes clear that God's justice begins in solidarity with the oppressed in their struggle to find freedom from crucifying realities. The cross also tells us something about the state of our very humanity, as it calls us to what I have called a crucifying kenosis. That Jesus was crucified, and as we know, refused to save himself from being crucified, reveals the fact that he emptied himself of any sense of privilege that might be bestowed upon him due to his maleness, Jewishness, or even divinity. In short, he let go of that which would set him apart from and prevented him from seeing the humanity of the very ones that were othered, marginalized, and crucified in his time. And in so doing, as mentioned earlier, he was able to feel their pain and suffering, manifesting empathetic solidarity with them. It is in this way that the cross reveals the extent of Jesus' empathetic capacity for other human beings, especially those who suffered most. And in so doing, it reveals the depth of his humanity. Nothing, in fact, reveals more his perfect humanity than when he cries out from the cross in the agony of doubt, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Perhaps it is in this moment that Jesus too reveals a very human restlessness for God's justice. Be that as it may, what the cross tells us most definitively is that our very humanity is inextricably related to our confronting our own biases, stereotypes, ways of seeing and knowing the world and others, so to empty ourselves of them. It calls us, the cross, into a self-emptying, that is, a crucifying kenosis of all that would prevent us from respecting and recognizing the humanity of another, and thus betraying our very own humanity. Essentially, the cross tells us that our empathetic capacity for others, especially those our world and society so easily crucifies, is inextricably linked to our capacity to accept, as Jesus did, our very own humanity. This means claiming our own human vulnerability to pain, suffering, and hurt, and to death, as opposed to constructing ways to protect ourselves from it, so to delude ourselves into believing that we are not like them, that is, the crucified lot in the world. It is, in fact, in this way that systems and structures of unjust privilege, as well as the dehumanizing ideologies, teachings, and doctrines that legitimate them, actually reflect the extent to which we are estranged from our own humanity, even as they betray the humanity of others. And it is the case that the more estranged we are from our own humanity, the more our empathetic capacity is eroded. Put simply, to be oblivious to the humanity of another signals our alienation from our own humanity, which manifests itself in empathy incapacitation. This brings me to the last couple points I will highlight this evening about the cross as it relates to God's justice. The cross makes clear the inextricable relationship between God's justice and God's love. What Emilie says about love and justice when it comes to ethics is true of God. Love and justice, she says, are extremely natural, if not necessary, dance partners. And again, nothing shows this more when it comes to God than the cross. On the cross, God takes on the extremity of human hate to show the enormity and power of divine love. This is not a passive, romanticized love. This is an active love, a love on the move through human history, a love that does not accept or relent to any form of injustice. For injustice of any kind is an affront to God's very love for all of God's creatures. And so it is that even though God was not responsible for Jesus' crucifixion, it was the love of God that made Jesus' crucifixion virtually inevitable. That Jesus was nothing less than the perfect embodiment of God meant that he invariably contested injustice anywhere he found it, even in the temple. And again, it was because he contested injustice that he was crucified. So it is that God's love reveals itself in the world as justice, a justice that refuses to compromise with anything that violates God's very love for God's humanity. And this brings us to another aspect of God's justice made clear through the cross. On the cross, Jesus not only refuses to respond to the hate and venom spewed at him by his crucifiers, but he also asks God to forgive those who would crucify him. Now, I have spoken at length, especially in my book, Resurrection Hope, about the nature of this forgiveness, distinguishing it from some cheap form of grace, so I won't repeat it here. The point I want to make now is that inasmuch as God's justice reflects love, then God's justice is never retributive or vengeful. Retributive justice is an anomaly to divine justice, for typically it lends itself to the kind of antagonistic and oppositional relationships which fuel and feed wars. Essentially, retributive justice reflects, even as it fosters, a cycle of dehumanization. And so the whole notion of retributive justice is oxymoronic in general, let alone when it comes to God. God's justice works to bring us into relationship with ourselves, that is, connecting us to our own humanity, with one another, leading us to valuing the humanity of others, and into a just and loving community, one which values the sacred dignity of all human beings. Essentially, the justice of God is nothing less than God loving us into loving relationships. In the words of Emily Towns, God's love for us is unconditional, and this love moves us to grow in compassion, understanding, and acceptance of others as we learn how to love the heart of others in ourselves. She continues, we also practice the formation of a divine human community based on love, pointed toward justice. And so it is that God's love actually overcomes the cross, as in the end, Jesus is resurrected, thus signaling God's ever-present movement in human history, loving us into loving. And as I come to the end, I ask, so what? For when all is said and done, crucifying injustice still continues, seemingly unabated, destroying lives, destroying the lives of Black and brown children. The cross is indeed real. This brings me back to King's question. How long will justice be crucified? Ironically, King answered this question the day before he asked it. For the day before arriving on the courthouse steps in Montgomery, Alabama, he said this. He said, yes, we are on the move, and no wave of racism can stop us. We are on the move now, he said, like an ideal whose time has come. Not even the marching of mighty armies can halt us. We are moving, he said. We are moving to the land of freedom. The question of how long, therefore, is in many respects the wrong question. For to understand the meaning of the cross and all of its theological and historical complexity is to ask the question not how long must we wait for God's justice, but what does God's justice require of us? Answer, it requires that we bear the cross again, not as an act of sacrifice, but as a commitment of faith to be on the move toward a divine justice that is freedom from all that prevents us from becoming a world, a community, a society where the humanity of each and every human being without exception is honored and respected. It is not, therefore, a matter of waiting for God's perfect justice to come down from on high, defeating forever crucifying realities. Rather, it is about being on the move with God to show forth the very justice that is God's. That is what it means to follow Jesus even unto the cross. Simply put, God's justice is not about a culminating future that we wait for. Rather, it is about a movement in our very present that we participate in. And so back to the beginning. I began this theological journey of faith with a restlessness for justice. That restlessness remains. Inasmuch as there is a restlessness for justice, it compels me, it compels us, not to wait or bemoan the realities of injustice, but to be on the move, participating in acts of justice in the places in which we find ourselves. It is in doing so that we will come to know the justice of God, which is nothing less than God's movement in the world, forever loving us into loving. In the end, the cross is real, but so too is God. So just as crucifying realities of injustice are forever present in our world, so too is the movement of God, and that is justice. And it is in this that I have faith. Thank you.
It is something to be in a space with this kind and this amount of intellectual brilliance, but also moral courage and clarity. Can you feel it? I want to ask, in fact, if you would please then join me again. And here I want to include the brilliance and moral courage and clarity of several of Garrett's PhD students who also poured out into this community today in collectively affirming all that has been shared with us this afternoon at Garrett Seminary. Thank you. My name is Dr. Jennifer Harvey, and I am the relatively new academic dean here at Garrett. And you might, like me, as you listened, found yourself being curious what Dr. Terrell or Dr. Towns or Dr. Sims might have said if they got to say, yes, Dr. Douglas, yes. And also, and so we're going to spend a few minutes. You each have a microphone, and we would love to share some time in conversation where you get to say with one another, yes, yes, and. I would love to start with a question for Dr. Towns and then just invite each of you to respond, engage, and lean in with one another. Dr. Towns, I'm wondering if you would share with us, if you would describe where you are most restless right now, and what is it vital that we understand about the role of imagination in this moment?
Now, you did 2 questions.
I'm the
if not
dean.
3. I'm an emerita. It is a confluence of things that I'm most restless about. I am, and it's more than restlessness, it is terror. And that is the way in which we continue to find various ways to polarize ourselves in this country and in the world. It came home to me with all of the conversations I've been hearing about Israel and Palestine, and the ways in which we are turning one another into caricatures of positions and not finding any sense of human lives live in the gray areas, not in the absolutes. But we use the absolutes to then kill each other, literally. And we honed this fine practice with what we have done with indigenous people, brown-skinned people, black-skinned people, beige-skinned people. So we have gotten very good at our polarizations. And they are rimmed with lies. But we try to call them facts. So I'm restless with seeing us continue to live into ways not to listen to one another, not to work with one another, not to ask one another, can you tell me who you are and what you really think? Because we don't put ourselves in situations that are not echo chambers of what we already think. And that's hard work, not to live in an echo chamber. But that, to me, is the work of the church, is to break down those echo chambers. So that's a lot of where my restlessness is these days, as I'm thinking and talking about it in public, is the way that polarizations are now driving our discourses and our lives. And once again, girl, 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 girl.
I'd love to invite the rest of you. Restlessness, where are you restless? And what about the role of imagination? What's vital for us to know about the imagination right now?
I think I'm restless around my concern for the life of my child, who's a 24-year-old young adult, who's mouthy, who's womanish, who is articulate and unafraid to speak her mind. And so for her life, I'm restless and thinking about it all the time, not just her life, but all the black children's lives, actually. So I'm restless around that, that very practical concern you have as a mother, still tied to your child's well-being. And I'm restless about that for all of black children and black lives generally. That's why I wrote the song Purple Blues, to address the idea that bad news can come to us at any time without us looking for it. I'm restless around my own aging process and my concern that I might not get to all the creative projects that I have in mind for my life, that I feel that are part of my capabilities and ability to contribute to the world. In fact, I have many gifts, and I'm pleased to be able to say that I've developed the skill of playwriting since I became a professor. One, as a pedagogical strategy to engage many of my students who didn't speak English as a first language. But I've developed this over 29 years of teaching, and wow, so I want to do this. I'm restless about this, and yet the demands of teaching, the demands of motherhood, the demands of, the body on aging are pressing. So these are the causes of my current concerns and my current sense of restlessness about where the future is moving.
So I find myself restless about a number of things, but perhaps most importantly about this notion of what it means not to be seen as fully human. That raises concerns for me about just the state of theological education in general and the ways in which so much of theological education is tied to a single funder. And what does that mean about the ethos of theological education? I also find myself really concerned about the ways in which historically the academy has always been 2 generations behind. And I'm restless about what's required in this moment for the academy to lead and not to follow a church that's in disarray.
Well, so I spend a lot of time talking about being restless, so, but I might take up this part of your question about the imagination, and in fact, drawing upon what Dr. Sims just said. First of all, though, I do have to add one last thing about my restlessness, and that is, when will we figure out that war doesn't make peace? That which makes peace is justice, not war. When we going to get that one? In terms of the imagination, what I call the moral imaginary, right? And restlessness and this thing called church and this thing called the academy. I am restless for the church to be church. So I say, to call ourselves church is aspirational. So I am restless for the church to be church, which means this. It is the church, if it is accountable to the more just future that is God's, it is the church that should lead the way in helping us to expand our moral imaginary of what it means to be just, what it means to be human. Now, inasmuch as the church doesn't do that, theological institutions are supposed to push the church to be church. Now, who knew that I would find myself, but it's in Legacy of Cone, quoting Barth. But you know, Karl Barth, right? In Cone, he did his dissertation on Barth, so we can rake Barth back up for a moment. Karl Barth said in his Dogmatics that theology ought to be the self-test of the church. That means, right, that theological institutions and seminary means seedbed for what? Seedbed for God's more just future. That theological institutions have to push the church, right, toward the claim that they make about being church. Theological institutions can't do that if their role is the role of preparing students to serve in religious institutions that just claim to be church. The role is to prepare students in transformative sort of ministries to help transform the church and the world, right? That's different. That's about formation, right? And it is only there that you can begin to expand the moral imaginary. But first, we have to free it from its institutionalization. And that's, right, well, I'll stop there, but
Thank you.
stop there.
Can we push on that just a little bit more, since we're sitting here in a theological institution? Because as we were announcing this event, and we called it Shades of Black, Theology and Ethics in a World on Fire, and every time I saw the title, I would think about sitting as a student in Dr. Cohn's class, and he would describe for us, as he introduced theology, that he had spent time in the 60s wrestling with what it meant to be studying theology when the civil rights movement was happening. And of course, out of that came black theology and black power. And Theology and Ethics in a World on Fire, as we sit in this theological institution, I thought, well, yeah, it's the same question, right? So what is that? What are we called to relative to theological education in this moment? What does it mean to spend time in these halls in a world on fire? What do we need to say about that today?
Well, as a teacher, I seriously encourage my students to bring their whole selves to the discipline of theology, not just learning the doctrines and the dates and so forth, and the personnel who have shaped the discipline, but to bring their whole selves to the task of bringing justice, mindedness to their congregations, to their institutions that they will be a part of, to bring their whole creative selves to it, to finding out what can I do, what can I teach, how can I be a better harbinger of God's justice for the people who I'm serving. So that's one of the things that I am very conscious of, that it's not just whether who we resource as our thinkers, but it's how we actually engage people in the transformative work that needs to take place in the life of the church. And not just the life of the church, the life of the mosque, the life of the temple, all of these places, because my students are more and more diverse in the times that we're now navigating.
Dean Harvey, I'm restless with that question because I can't remember who said it, but the essence of it is until you name the problem correctly, you can't address it. So I'm concerned that there are too many folk, particularly in the academy, and those who claim to be part of the church, who really don't believe that the world is on fire. And so how do we talk about prescriptive and solutions and creative imagining if we can't name the ways in which the world is on fire? And so I think about JoAnne's concern for her daughter. But when I think about my family, and we are a blended family, and so what does it mean when I have family members who don't have access to health care in certain states because a beloved cousin is a trans teen? What does it mean when my son and daughter-in-law could actually have their covenant relationship put at risk because if one right has been taken away for female autonomy, woman's autonomy, who's to say that certain relationships will no longer be recognized in this country? What does it mean when I have grandchildren who are white and they're trying to navigate a world with a black grandmother whom they dearly love? And how do they present themselves in context where then their own sense of humanity becomes questionable? And what does it mean to be a leader in theological education where you're wrestling with faculty who on the one hand want to talk about decolonizing a curriculum, but on the other hand want to cling to colonial practices that hold institutions captive? So I don't know if we're even ready to begin to name the ways in which the world is on fire.
Thank you.
And with that, there are some people who delight in building the fire and stoking it, and their understanding of being prophetic is to burn everything down. While they think somehow they're going to be absented from the carnage they create. And so for me, there's this sense of, my kind way of saying it is short-sightedness in once you start a revolution, and I won't call names like MAGA or any of that stuff, but once you start a revolution and you think you can control the worst impulse in people, the fire, you almost can't extinguish it because it takes a life of its own. And I think that's some of what we saw on January 6th. And folks don't want to act like that happened. We have I live in the state of Tennessee, and I'm a Southerner, so I went home to do the job at Vanderbilt. We have a representative who just decided he wasn't going to run for re-election after 3 terms because he said, federal government is broken. Well, damn it, he helped break it. And he's acting like he didn't do what he did. He's chair of the committee that just impeached Mayorkas. He's the chair of that committee. But somehow it got broken and he doesn't know how, so he's coming back home because he can be a better service in his home. That kind of fire making is dangerous, it's demonic, and some people even call it Christian.
There's nothing left to say. Oh, bring. Episcopalians don't bring us home. They'll bring you communion. I don't know. Amen to all that has been said. And I guess, Dean Harvey, I hear your question even in another way, or I'll take another angle into that question. And that question, because I know it's always hard, as it has been for each of us in our own context going through as students, to when the world is on fire, to there you are sitting reading a book, right? And you're sitting in places like this thinking about God. That's even more abstract. And so for me, the first thing is to recognize that it is a privilege and a luxury to be able to think. You can't think when you're hungry. You can't think when you're tired. You can't think when you've got other things that you're worried about, right? And so all of us, each from our own places with our own struggles or whatever, but we sitting in here thinking, right? It's a luxury. It's a privilege, right? But privilege, luxury, isn't in and of itself sinful. It's what we do with it, and with whom or to whom we hold ourselves accountable, right? And so I think we each have a role to play in the ways in which we play it. You know, with the gift that you have, if you're a scholar, if you're a writer, you have a role to play in making the world better and more just, more human, more humane. So that one doesn't have to feel guilty about liking to read books and sitting here. But the question is, what are you going to do with that? With whom and to whom are you accountable? Now, I want to end this way. I've talked about before. My grandmother, her name was Mama Dorsey, maternal grandmother. She didn't have, perhaps she had a 6th grade education, not sure. But I remember being at Union and sometimes sitting in there in Hastings Hall. That doesn't look like it looks now. Y'all remember Hastings Hall, right? You remember Hastings Hall, you know, and you open up the little oven in the kitchen and it wasn't food that would come running out of that oven. So, you know, but I remember thinking, oh, God, I got to do this work. And I would remember my grandmother, who didn't have an education, and it was deprived of her, and the people who died, for people that look like us sitting up here, to have an education. And they didn't die for us to have an education. All my grandmother wanted for her 4 grandchildren, she prayed, she put money aside. Remember when black people used to always buy little stamps and have insurance for everything? And so she put money aside, bought insurance policies that her 4 grandchildren would have when we finished high school. Now, people didn't die for us to be educated. Our grandmothers didn't put money aside for us when we finished high school, whatever, for us to be educated away from them. So the question is, not should we be sitting here? Yeah, we have the privilege to be sitting here. What you going to do with it? And to whom are you accountable? So yeah.
Thank you. It seems like just the right moment to invite you, Dr. Towns, to give us some closing remarks with deep appreciation.
There's going to be all kinds of roads in life to take. Let's not be afraid to take them because we deserve them. We are the sons and daughters of those old thirsty things Nana put in her tin can. We carry too many scars from the past. Our past owns us. Our mother's scars, our sister's scars, our father's scars, our son's scars, thick, hard, dirty scars, so that no one can ever pass through to hurt us again. Let's live our lives without living in the folds of old wounds.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Will you join me? Friends, colleagues, students, staff, faculty, go with a fire for justice. Amen.
Happy day when Jesus washed, oh, when he washed, when Jesus washed, he washed my sins away. Oh.